When Elden Ring first came out roughly 2 years ago, I was so excited for the game that I was one of those people that lost sleep days before its release. I even thought it was going to be the perfect giant combination of all of FromSoftware's previous titles that not only would keep me entertained for years to come, but like other Soulsborne games have done for me, get me through some pretty dark times in my life. So after clocking over 100 hours of getting my ass handed to me, I can't deny that Elden Ring is an amazing game. But it's definitely not perfect. So 2 years later, I find myself with the feeling of wanting to play a Soulsborne game again, but for some reason I would rather play Dark Souls or Bloodborne for my 5th playthrough instead of my 2nd playthrough of Elden Ring. So why do I find myself returning to Dark Souls and Bloodborne over Elden Ring? Well, let's break it down. I probably thought too much about this, but the 3 aspects I found where Elden Ring falls short are the open world design, the way that exploration works, and the unfortunate choice of bosses and enemies throughout the game. But towards the end, these points will give you quite a bit to think about because they all relate to potential issues the new DLC might have to deal with. Now, while I found myself drawn back to the older games for subsequent playthroughs, I felt in order to make this video, I had to revisit Elden Ring anyway. And ironically, the more I played, the clearer it became why I kept gravitating towards the older titles. But before we dive into my first ever video on here, I want to mention there will be some spoilers for the FromSoft games, so if you plan to play them, stop watching right now. Elden Ring's open world, it could be better, and in my opinion, it actually ruins some of what makes other FromSoft games so amazing and unique. And weirdly enough, one of the main things that did this for me is the number of sites of grace throughout the world. Now, regardless of what playthrough I did, both times I noticed that some sites are so close together with no enemies in between that I might as well be like, huh? This happens throughout the world, and a great example is in Caelid, where the Caelid Highway site is less than 10 seconds away from the Swamp site of Grace, while both are also within 20 seconds of 2 more sites of Grace as well. And yeah, maybe you can justify this in an open world, but when you have too many sites of grace in a linear area, it kinda sucks. Take the beginning of Stormvale Castle. You technically only need to fight one Swordbird dude till you find another site. Personally, I found this to be an issue because in other FromSoft games, whether it be lamps or bonfires, there was never too many, and for a good reason. And that's because even though they act as checkpoints in the game, they also act as safe havens that will give you a huge feeling of relief when you found them. The reason for that is because usually you would find them after traversing through extremely tough areas or fighting really tough bosses. And no matter what playthrough you did, you would always have to deal with that challenge. In Dark Souls, if you ever went off exploring, got lost and ran into a tough enemy or ambush, you would be praying that there was a bonfire around the corner, because at this point you would be low on healing, carrying heaps of souls, and literally thinking, I'm so fucked. Not to mention, if you died, to find your lost souls, you would have to remember your surroundings in order to go back while going through the whole challenge again that got you killed in the first place. And this would mean there was always this feeling of tension when traversing the world. For me, this would deepen my immersion in the world because I had to be paying attention at all times. I felt like I was really in a world, not a game. However, in Elden Ring, if you ever got lost in the open world and found yourself in a bad situation, you could just open up your map and fast travel out of there, but even if you died, your lost runes would show up on the map or compass anyway. I found all I had to do was find the nearest site of grace, hop on torrent, quickly grab them, and then run away. So because of this, I started to lose immersion when I started to see sites of grace as checkpoints or fast travel points instead of a place of refuge. Everything I have just mentioned is probably some of why the legacy dungeons are the best part of the game, because they feel like what all the other titles do. But I do understand that in an open world it's extremely necessary to have lots of fast travel points, but it does come at a cost. On top of this, there's something else I wanted to mention, and that is the disappointing enemy encounters throughout the open world. You'll notice in Elden Ring pretty quickly that normal enemies don't drop many runes, and the more you play, the more you realize that fighting them is a waste of time, so you might as well go around them or just hop on torrent and run past them while collecting the items on the way. Then, on replays of the game, you become so aware of this that it becomes boring and you're incentivized to just run past everything just to get to the good parts of the games, like the legacy dungeons. Back to the older games, even on multiple playthroughs, the linear structure of the world paired with enemy encounters such as ambushes meant they would always pose a challenge, and running past them is so much harder in those games. A classic example of this is in Dark Souls and Anor Londo, where you have to run around the outskirts of the castle dodging the Silver Knights shooting huge huge arrows, and no matter how many times I do this, this is still so hard. Back to an open world like Elden Ring, you can avoid all these things if you want to, maybe not in the legacy dungeons, but definitely in the open world. I know I'm being negative so far, but don't get me wrong, this game still slaps.
You can't just...
The reason I'm making such a big deal about this is because things like this in Elden Ring begin to make it feel more like a game and less like a world, and for me, when I'm feeling a bit depressed in life, I want to escape my own reality and dive into another world so I can forget about my real world troubles because I'm so immersed in it. I don't want to be reminded I'm playing a game because that just reinforces the fact I have to deal with the real world eventually. When it comes to exploration, FromSoft has always been the GOAT, but for the first time ever, exploration in Elden Ring feels like the GOAT is missing a few legs. Now don't get me wrong, Elden Ring has some amazing moments of exploration. We all know how it feels to explore the right side of Limgrave into Mistwood, find the world's longest elevator, and then be rewarded with a whole new amazing area. It's things like this that get you really excited to explore because you never know what to expect, and you as the player get this strong sense of depth and connection to the world. All the other FromSoft games do this too, with one of the best examples being in Dark Souls, where if you explore the depths well enough, you can eventually find the hidden area, Ash Lake. Basically, you get rewarded for being a diligent player. But the problem with Elden Ring is sometimes you get punished for being a diligent player. So back to when I first played Elden Ring, I tried to explore Limgrave as much as possible. I even went and found as many caves, catacombs and everjails as I could. I was super happy with myself because these were great first time experiences. Then I progressed into Liurnia and eventually other areas of the game, all while trying to explore as best as I could. But unfortunately, while I was doing that, I quickly started to realize these pieces of content all look like the ones in Limgrave, with the same enemies, sometimes the same bosses, and usually with pointless loot. And it got so boring because I knew what to expect. I was basically being punished for exploring too much. Towards the end, I had this feeling of burnout, like I had replayed some of the game already, and then on my replay of the game, I knew what to expect in 90% of the dungeons, so I had no reason whatsoever to go exploring inside them. And that's a huge issue for me because in every other FromSoft game, I want to explore even more than my first playthrough because I want to see what I missed. But this wasn't the only way I was punished for exploring too much. As I mentioned before, I explored as much of Limgrave as I could, and I also did the same in Liurnia too. Then eventually I realized I could go into the Weeping Peninsula, and I was super stoked to be able to explore an area that I missed earlier on. But when I got there, I was bodying every enemy in about 2 to 3 hits, and it was the easiest thing I had ever done. And initially, the power trip was kinda cool, but then I started getting annoyed. I was clearly over leveled and should have explored this area towards the start of the game. And that's a big thing because the challenge that Soulsborne games bring is one of the best things about them, so in my eyes I had ruined an entire area because I did too much exploring in other parts of the game. And then it got even worse because I went to Caelid afterwards, and this essentially happened again, maybe not as bad, but an area that looked extremely intimidating ended up being a joke from my experience. Now for a replay, it was actually good knowing this because I could avoid doing it wrong like I did the first time, but while I was doing this, I became hesitant about exploring in the wrong direction in case I would ruin my experience again, and I lost that sense of freedom an open world should give. This type of stuff doesn't happen in the other games simply because of the linear-ish structure. You were always directed in the right path. The only way to really be over leveled was to farm enemies, and let's be honest, it's boring as fuck. So after saying and experiencing all this, there was something that dawned on me, and I bet a lot of you Souls players would understand this, and that is, for the most part, we don't give a fuck what the item reward is at the end of our exploration, because the true reward was that experience we went through to get it. So as a player in Elden Ring, after going through an unrewarding experience of exploration to then finding a rare purple tinged item for it to just be a butterfly you could get anywhere else was just annoying. So I guess in conclusion, exploration in Elden Ring isn't bad, but it's not amazing like how it is in the older games. When that feeling of awe and excitement is lost upon discovering new things, you end up losing that deep connection to the world that the older games are so good at providing. That thrill of exploration is what keeps my mind sane at times, and is something I wish Elden Ring did more consistently. Now we can't talk about FromSoft games without discussing the most important part, the bosses, and what blows my mind about Elden Ring is just how disappointing a solid chunk of them are. Boss fights, for the most part, in any Souls game are literally the most epic and rewarding experiences in gaming. Like even the cinematic before a grueling boss fight feels like a reward simply because of how damn cool it looks. But unfortunately, Elden Ring takes away just how cool and unique these boss fights are. Now this isn't the only point about the bosses I want to discuss, but it is probably the biggest issue, and that is just how repetitive the boss fights are, especially compared to the older games. Now when Elden Ring was first announced with over 100 bosses, I was hella excited because going off my previous experiences of how consistently good boss fights were, I thought I'd hit the holy grail of Souls. But to then find out that only 8 of the 165 bosses are truly unique was a big letdown, especially after experiencing it for myself. Now I say the word truly because yes, the color of fire a dragon breathes is different, but it doesn't change how I need to avoid it. I can even justify a few repetitive bosses like the Knight's Cavalry and Erdtree Avatar because they seem to match the lore, but it doesn't change the fact that it's still an unrewarding experience, and you could even cut the number of times they appear to half and it would still feel repetitive. Things like this become an even bigger issue when you have to explore an already repetitive dungeon to then be rewarded with a repetitive boss fight like the good old statue cat. And here's the thing, some of the older games do have repetitive boss fights too. Anyone who plays Dark Souls will be very familiar with the Stray Demon fight because it turns up 2 more times later on and the fights don't really change that much. Quite often, this is something Dark Souls is criticized for, and I agree it is one of the game's weaker points. Now back to Elden Ring. This happens at a far grander scale, and again, I believe it's a weak point for the game, but Elden Ring steps it up a notch by making huge story relevant bosses like Margit, Godric and Mohg appear more than once. Like, could you imagine if in Bloodborne how lackluster Father Gascoigne would be if you fought him even one more time in a random Evergaol like you do with Godric? So when it comes to replaying the game, I no longer look forward to the spectacle of certain bosses. I kinda feel like I can skip so many of them because I could experience them later on anyway, and this is something you don't experience in the older games. But there is one more thing I noticed about bosses in Elden Ring, and that is some of the bosses literally seem like they're playing Sekiro while I'm playing Dark Souls. Now before you think it, this has nothing to do with the whole get good culture of the game, but I do think there are a decent amount of bosses that have these super long or fast jumpy combos that are extremely difficult to dodge or even engage with. Malenia is an obvious example, but Malekith, Margit and the Elden Beast plus more all have these moments of either waiting for the combo to finish or chasing after them just to get one measly hit in. The problem isn't that it's hard to do these things, but that the best method for dealing with them is pretty boring. Like, I firmly believe that if there was a parry mechanic like in Sekiro, or if I could at least use Torrent for the Elden Beast, these fights at the very least would be more fun and engaging. If you decide to go back and play Dark Souls 3, you'll notice quickly that bosses have more openings and they're slower than Elden Ring, but they do feel more involved because the best way to deal with them is by staying close and engaging with learning the dodge timings as opposed to sitting back and waiting for the combo to finish. It's not a huge issue, but I noticed from my replay that I wasn't looking forward to certain main boss fights because what was required to deal with them was boring, and again, this was something I really experienced in the older games. So FromSoft's DLC was conveniently announced while I was making this video, and I actually can't wait for its release. If there's one thing FromSoft is consistent at, it's that their DLCs quite often end up being better than their main game. Personally, I think Bloodborne's Old Hunter DLC is one of the greatest things of all time, and because of this consistency, I have pretty good reason to believe that Shadow of the Erdtree has potential to be even better than the game. But with the things I have mentioned throughout this video, such as repetitive dungeons and boss fights, could you imagine if this was implemented into the DLC? I think it's pretty fair to say that the new DLC is pretty expendy, and if I'm paying 70 NZ bucks for something that isn't even a full game, I genuinely think I'll be annoyed if I came across the same level of repetitiveness just at a smaller scale. For instance, we know that Mesmer the Impaler is going to be a significant part of the DLC and probably a sick boss fight, but if I find him in a random Evergaol, not only will that sickness of the first fight be taken away, I'm gonna be the one that slaps. But in saying this, I'm still confident that the DLC will be good, and FromSoft has never let me down when it comes to this. I just hope they don't redo some of what I believe are mistakes. Overall, I still think Elden Ring is one of the best games to currently exist, even though I spent most of this video talking about the negatives. But you see, this game is supposedly a 10 out of 10, and yet I found it very strange that I didn't want to replay a game that's meant to be a 10 out of 10. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the game to me feels more like an 8.5 or a 9 out of 10. And after discussing all the points that led me to this, I found one thing that all these had in common. They all affected how immersed I could get into the game. I would say the biggest culprit for breaking the immersion has gotta be the amount of copying and pasting in the game, but if you pair this with an open world that causes you to run around mindlessly that also gets extremely easy and hard for no obvious reason, you get just that, a game. Personally, I need more than that. I need a world, and a super immersive world is what I have come to expect out of a FromSoft game. So when they don't do it as well as previous games, I find it's something that stands out a lot, and like I said earlier, these games have been so influential for me that they have literally helped me through awful times in my life. So when I feel like trash and the game isn't immersive enough to help me feel like a polished turd, then I know something ain't right. Oh, and just to reinforce this, in order to make this video, I had to replay a majority of the games just so I would have gameplay to put into it, and oh my god, after going through Elden Ring again, I honestly don't know when I will ever play it again because I'm actually so sick of it. But at the end of the day, I still love these games and can't wait for the DLC or even Elden Ring 2. And if you made it to the end of this video, all I have to say is I have no idea what I'm doing. Thank you so much, and I hope it made you go, yeah.